this question came up on Reddit recently, and then it also came up in a few other places, and I thought, I don't think I've done a video on this specific topic before, though I'm sure I've touched on it in other videos. Load on the Game Master. How to manage it, how to reduce it, so that one does not suffer GM burnout. One moment while I cough. Thank you for your patience. One of the things that causes GM burnout really is the workload. Obviously, if you do any one thing for a long enough time, you sort of get burnt out on it. But it will happen faster if the thing that you are doing is kind of more difficult than it is rewarding. GMing is a rewarding experience for a lot of people, myself included. But it has to balance the rewards that you get for running a game and doing it well and facilitating fun for the people that you are socializing with, and the workload that is involved in that. Some games do this better than others. And to an extent, it is a factor of the rules weightiness of the game that you are playing. So if you're playing a big, chunky game, there's going to be more workload for you. And should be, ideally, more workload for everybody. You know, that's just kind of how it is. That's the price that you pay for a more comprehensive and more well-defined, more rigidly structured set of rules. And that is a style, and some people like that more than others. It's cool. I mean, sometimes I enjoy it as well. But beyond just the general weightiness, the general crunchiness of the game system that you are playing, there are certain specific things that a game can do to alleviate the load on the Game Master, to make it easier for them to run the game, and to help, maintain sanity in a process that can really take its toll on somebody. It is running a game is a lot of work. No, not regardless. I was going to say regardless of the game you're running. For some games, it's not a lot of work. Some games it's very, very easy, and I'll be getting to that. So let's start off with examples of how to do it badly. And I'm going to talk about 5th edition. I'm also going to talk about 3rd edition. So 5th edition D&D and 3rd edition D&D are both very weighty games in different ways. 3rd edition has a lot of rules, a lot of systems, a lot of math, tables, charts, conditional modifiers, the works. There's a lot to keep track of. It's a big mental load. When I was young, sure, I could memorize all these rules, no problem. And I can deploy them at a moment's notice. I was a rules encyclopedia back in the day. No more. I don't do that stuff anymore. I have too much stuff going on. I can't do that. I got spoiled on another game that came out afterwards. You know the one. 5th edition D&D is difficult for other reasons. While, yes, there are still kind of a lot of rules to keep track of, a lot of it is a matter of the rules not being well defined. 3rd edition just had lots of rules. Too many rules, one might say. But if you knew what you were looking for and you understood how the books were laid out, you could find those rules, and you could, with enough mental capacity, you could memorize them all. 5th edition has a lot of missing rules, or rules that are very unintuitive. A lot of rules that are not obvious, or that there are straight up missing rules. I've talked before about how angry I was when I discovered that 5th edition D&D actually doesn't have rules for forced movement. It doesn't define a push or a pull and how you can move someone during these effects. Or can you pull someone into someone else's space and leave them there? Can you stack up any number of creatures into a 5-foot space with push and pull effects, When I found out that for years I had just imported 4th edition's force movement rules and kind of assumed that that's how it must work. I hadn't even realized I had done that. I was so mad. But there's lots of stuff. Like, most 5e players probably can't tell you the difference between a attack with a melee weapon and a melee weapon attack. Those are different terms in the game. And it's not obvious. There's that kind of stuff. This sort of stuff, like, there's an intuition that it probably should work a certain way. It's not how the rules are written. So you end up accidentally homebrewing things, which means that you might actually change the ruling depending on how you intuit it to work a different time. That can create problems. Inconsistent rulings. But also, if somebody is familiar with the rules and they come to your table and they are now playing with it and you do your usual ruling, oh yeah, this is the way we've always done it. And they're like, well, that's not the way it is in the rules. Is that a house rule that you have? And you're like, what house rule? This is how it is. And they're like, actually, no, it's not. And then it creates an argument. I've had, and don't tell me it doesn't. I've had this argument a dozen times where, like, oh, well, the rules actually say this. And someone else is like, well, no, that's clearly ridiculous. You're just making that up. And I'm like, no, I'm not. Actually, this is how the rules do work. If you look into it, and here's like the sources. And then that's even before you get into the complication of like, oh, Jeremy Crawford tweets. Are we accepting those as official rulings? Or the Sage Advice column, are we accepting those as rulings? 5e is a complicated system that markets itself as not a complicated system. It's very difficult to figure out how to run this game rules as written. It's hard to know how the game is supposed to be run. That's how complicated it is. So there's those examples of how to do it wrong. How do you do it right? How do you alleviate the load on the game master? And I would say there are 2 avenues, and you can pursue either or both depending on the type of game that you are designing. Let's say you're designing a game. One method, and the method that I think is probably most intuitive, and is probably the most widespread, is to have well-defined rules. Honestly, 3rd edition did this okay. Like, the rules, there's a lot of rules. There's too many rules. There's too many mechanics, too many numbers, too many modifiers, too much math going on. But the rules that are there are well-defined, well-laid out, well-established. They are knowable. So on a game that is a little bit more sane with regards to the amount of stuff you have to know and remember as a GM, having those things be well laid out, well defined, is very helpful to the GM. Not just because then they can learn the rules. That obviously they can then learn the rules, but also so that the players can learn the rules. And if the players know the rules just as well as the GM, there's a lot fewer times where the player's going to go, can I do this? And then the GM has to like stop what they're doing, think about the question, process it through the rules that they know, and then answer the question. Well, no, everybody just knows. Yeah, I can do this. We know that I can do this. That actually does really help take a load off the GM, is if the rules are simple enough and well enough defined that the entire table can know them. And more importantly, that answers can be easily gotten by reading the text. That's important. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is to create more opportunities for players to have narrative and mechanical agency in the game. This is a little bit more complicated, and it's a little bit less widespread. A lot of really good games do this, but not the majority of the current generation of RPGs that I've seen anyways. By giving players more agency, and I'm talking about things like the player getting the last say on what stats they use for a roll. Because a lot of, you think traditionally in D&D, it's the GM calls for a specific kind of roll. Make a perception check, make a stealth check, make a sleight of hand check, persuasion check, whatever. The GM is the one calling it. And obviously there can be some conversation there. Like, well, actually, I'm not trying to bluff. I'm trying to intimidate. Oh, okay, well then switch it over. But the GM makes the final call. I'm talking about games where the player makes that kind of decision. What kind of stat they're going to use? You know, am I spending a resource to gain narrative control of the scene? Am I doing a flashback maneuver because the rules say that I can? I don't need to ask permission. I can just do this. That kind of stuff does offload a lot of the load from the GM onto the players. Because the load has to happen somewhere. Someone at the table needs to make these kinds of decisions. It can't just go away. There's no magical... Well, I mean, like, to an extent, you can make the game simpler. But without making the game simpler, while still having all the constituent parts of the game, you can't just make complexity or decision-making disappear. You have to move it and spread it around the table. And by spreading it a little bit more evenly, the GM, who inherently has the toughest job, their job gets a little bit easier. Fabula Ultima does this. Blades in the Dark does this. Great games. And it gives the players agency over the kinds of things that they are doing and the way that they are going to interact with the mechanics. This not only offloads some of the burden of being a GM, but it also gives the players more agency, which you know is something that I'm all about. It makes the players feel more invested, more capable of steering the game, and it makes the game more in alignment with the way that I used to describe D&D, which is collaborative storytelling. I don't think D&D is particularly collaborative. It is to an extent, obviously. It is a group dynamic. But there isn't a lot of collaboration in regards to the way that the story is constructed. It's more or less the DM doing it. Which is not to say that, like, you have, like, this is not talking about railroading. But, like, the DM is in charge of steering the story, and maybe he'll, you know, let a player put a hand on the wheel a little bit, but it is still the GM is in charge. In some RPGs, such as the ones that I have named, and others, there's a lot more emphasis on collaboratively, as a whole table, as a group, deciding how these narratives play out. Particularly those RPGs where it encourages the GM not to decide how an obstacle is supposed to be overcome or how a scene is supposed to play out. Like, you sort of set up the obstacles, and then you are along for the ride, along with everyone else, to see how it plays out, to see what happens. That kind of design really helps make it so that the GM not only has reduced burden, but also gets to have those moments of discovery like a player, and thus helps avoid burnout even more. Because it's not just about burden, it's also about, like, the sort of monotony, the predictability, the repetitiveness of being a GM. In a game like D&D, it can get to you. You know, there's certain gameplay loops that happen over and over and over. But in a game where players have a lot of mechanical and narrative agency, they can make these kinds of decisions, they can spend resources to, you know, do flashbacks or whatever. Like, as a GM, you never know what's going to happen. You're there to discover the way that this narrative is going to play out, just like everyone else is. And that really helps keep things fresh. So those are the two ways that are, I think, primarily responsible for reducing the GM load in RPGs. Clearly defined rules, well-defined rules that everyone can learn, and improving player agency, mechanically and narratively. Those two together help reduce GM load, makes it easier to run the game, and then you won't be, like D&D, having a game master problem. You know? When you make the game kind of hard to run, people don't want to run it. Big surprise. You know? Yeah, you can't figure it out. There's no solution. The world's greatest role-playing game can't do it, so it can't be done.